Step into the suffocating, humid port city of Wilmington, North Carolina, in the tense, sweltering autumn of 1898. The Cape Fear River cuts through a thriving, cosmopolitan metropolis that represents the absolute zenith of post-Civil War progress. You are standing in the largest, most economically vibrant city in the state, and a profound political miracle is unfolding right in front of your eyes. A powerful, multiracial coalition known as the Fusionist Party, a highly effective alliance of newly freed black Republicans and working-class white populists, has legally swept the elections. They have taken total control of the local government, actively proving that the bitter, racial divisions of the old plantation South can be overcome by unified working-class solidarity. Black men are serving as city aldermen, magistrates, and highly respected police officers, walking the brick-paved streets with authority and dignity. A brilliant black publisher named Alexander Manley operates the Daily Record, the only daily black-owned newspaper in the entire nation, printing editorials that fiercely challenge the toxic, ingrained narratives of white supremacy. The black citizens of Wilmington have built thriving businesses, established robust educational institutions, and secured genuine political power through the legitimate mechanisms of American democracy. But the wealthy, aristocratic descendants of the Confederate elite, the men who used to own the massive plantations and dictate the laws of the state, are watching this multiracial prosperity with a deeply venomous, escalating rage. The Democratic Party of 1898, controlled by furious white supremacists, cannot fathom existing in a society where a black man holds authority over a white man. They realize that they cannot win at the ballot box. The Fusionist coalition is simply too popular, too unified, and too mathematically dominant. So, the bitter white elite make a terrifying, highly calculated decision that will permanently alter the trajectory of American history. They decide to abandon the democratic process entirely and orchestrate the only successful, violently executed coup d'etat ever to take place on United States soil. Before we witness the horrific militarized destruction of this democratic stronghold, you must understand why this specific story has been so aggressively buried. The modern establishment relies on a population that believes the American democratic process has always been an unbroken, peaceful transition of power. They want you scrolling through endless digital distractions, disconnected from the terrifying reality that wealthy elites have previously used organized paramilitary violence to successfully overthrow a legally elected American government. We are assembling a worldwide, highly educated battalion of truth seekers who refuse to let these blood-soaked historical warnings be deleted. Stand up right now and prove you are paying attention. Drop your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our global network and show the architects of this algorithmic amnesia that we are actually awake. To execute their unprecedented treason, the white supremacist elite launch a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered campaign of psychological warfare and physical terror. They rely heavily on the local white newspapers, specifically the News and Observer, to flood the state with grotesque, racist propaganda, fabricating hysterical lies about a looming black uprising to terrify the white population into a violent frenzy. But propaganda is not enough to overthrow a government. They need a heavily armed military force. The political elite actively sponsor the Red Shirts, a ruthless paramilitary death squad that operates as the militant wing of the Democratic Party. These furious men, wearing bright crimson shirts to loudly advertise their violent intentions, begin openly patrolling the dirt roads and brick streets of Wilmington on horseback. They carry high-powered Winchester repeating rifles and heavy shotguns, terrorizing black voters, assassinating key political organizers in the dark swamps outside the city, and explicitly promising a massive, unavoidable bloodbath if the fusionist government does not immediately surrender power. As the fateful November election day approaches, The suffocating tension in Wilmington reaches an apocalyptic breaking point. The wealthy white businessmen of the city quietly purchase a highly advanced, devastating weapon of mass destruction. A rapid-fire Colt machine gun capable of firing hundreds of heavy-caliber rounds per minute, and secretly mount it to a mobile wagon. The stage is set not for an election, but for a meticulously planned, heavily militarized slaughter designed to drown the multiracial democracy of Wilmington in a massive river of blood. The morning of November 8th dawns over the Cape Fear River not with the sacred, peaceful exercise of democratic rights, but with the terrifying, mechanical clatter of lever-action rifles chambering heavy rounds. The red shirts, emboldened by their wealthy aristocratic benefactors and fueled by months of hysterical racist propaganda, physically barricade the polling stations across every ward in Wilmington. Black citizens who bravely attempt to navigate the dirt streets to cast their legal ballots are met with unflinching paramilitary violence. They are brutally beaten on the brick sidewalks, threatened with immediate execution, and forcibly driven away from the ballot boxes by mobs of armed men wearing bright crimson. Simultaneously, corrupt Democratic operatives aggressively stuff the wooden ballot boxes with thousands of fraudulent votes, executing a massive, coordinated theft of the local election in broad daylight. But the deeply entrenched white supremacist elite, commanded by a vicious, bitter former Confederate officer named Alfred Moore Waddell, recognized that simply rigging the political offices is not enough to secure their permanent reign. They demand psychological submission, the total eradication of black economic independence, and the violent expulsion of the legally elected fusionist leaders. The day after the stolen election, the aristocratic conspirators publish a tyrannical, deeply racist document they aggressively title The White Declaration of Independence. It explicitly states that the city will no longer tolerate the political or economic participation of black citizens. They issue a terrifying, unyielding ultimatum to the black community, specifically targeting Alexander Manley, the brilliant publisher of the Daily Record. They demand he permanently shutter his newspaper and immediately flee the city, or face total annihilation. When the tense manufactured deadline expires on the morning of November 10th, Waddell summons a heavily armed civilian army of over 2,000 furious white men directly to the Wilmington City Armory. Standing before the surging, bloodthirsty crowd, the former Confederate officer delivers a psychotic, blood-soaked speech, explicitly ordering his paramilitary forces to physically choke the currents of the Cape Fear River with black carcasses, if that is what it takes to reestablish absolute white supremacy. The massive militarized mob immediately marches through the commercial district, violently dragging the terrifying, rapid-fire Colt machine gun directly behind them. Their very first target is the undeniable symbol of black intellectual defiance and economic success: the two-story wooden printing office of the Daily Record. The vigilantes smash through the heavy glass windows, tear the complex, expensive iron printing presses apart with heavy sledgehammers, and systematically douse the entire structure in highly combustible kerosene. As the match is struck, the resulting inferno sends a towering, suffocating pillar of thick black smoke high into the crisp Carolina sky. This massive column of smoke is not just a burning building. It is a terrifying visual signal to the entire city that the fragile, multiracial democracy has been shattered, and the violent, state-sanctioned coup d'etat has officially begun. As the flames consume the Daily Record, the white populist allies who had formed the fusionist coalition alongside the black voters suddenly evaporate into the shadows, terrified of the red shirts and abandoning their political partners to save themselves. The black community is left isolated, surrounded by a heavily armed, furious mob that controls the streets, the telegraph wires, and the exits to the city. The black citizens of Wilmington, seeing the smoke rising from their beloved newspaper, realize with chilling certainty that the local law enforcement has been compromised, and that a horrific, inescapable slaughter is marching directly toward their neighborhoods. Women and children desperately begin fleeing toward the dense, freezing swamps outside the city limits, grabbing whatever meager possessions they can carry, while the black men scramble to find whatever rusted hunting weapons they possess to barricade their streets and defend their homes from the surging white supremacist army. The towering pillar of smoke rising from the ruined newspaper office acted as a grim, undeniable starting gun for a localized genocide. Intoxicated by the destruction and emboldened by the absolute lack of any federal or state intervention, the heavily militarized mob pivoted away from the smoldering commercial district and marched directly into Brooklyn, the primary black residential neighborhood of Wilmington. The ensuing violence was not a clash between rival factions. It was a unilateral, mechanized slaughter of deeply terrified, heavily outgunned civilians. The white vigilantes dragged the custom-mounted Colt rapid-fire machine gun through the dirt streets, aggressively pointing the heavy iron barrel directly at the wooden houses where black families were desperately hiding. Whenever a brave black resident fired a hunting musket from a window in a frantic attempt to protect his home, the vigilantes unleashed a devastating, continuous hail of armor-piercing machine gun fire, shredding the thin wooden walls and tearing through the innocent people huddled inside. The brick-paved avenues of the wealthy coastal city rapidly devolved into a chaotic, blood-soaked war zone. Red shirts on horseback hunted fleeing black men through the alleys, executing them at point-blank range and leaving their bodies to bleed out in the gutters. While the residential streets echoed with the deafening stutter of machine gun fire and the agonizing screams of dying men, the aristocratic architects of this treason executed the chilling bureaucratic phase of their master plan. Alfred Moore Waddell, flanked by a contingent of heavily armed, furious paramilitaries, stormed directly into Wilmington's City Hall. They cornered the legally elected fusionist mayor, Silas P. Wright, and his biracial board of aldermen inside the government chambers. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the very real threat of immediate assassination. At the terrifying point of cocked Winchester rifles, Waddell and his conspirators physically forced the democratically elected officials to sign formal, legally binding letters of resignation, one by one. As soon as an alderman dropped his pen and surrendered his office under extreme duress, the armed mob immediately installed one of their own white supremacist conspirators into the vacant seat. By the late afternoon, the violent transition of power was absolute. Waddell arrogantly seized the mayor's gavel, effectively finalizing the only successful armed overthrow of a legitimate municipal government in the history of the United States. They did not just steal an election, they used raw, unchecked paramilitary violence to physically dismantle an American democracy from the inside out. As the illegitimate government seized control of City Hall, the humanitarian crisis in the surrounding coastal swamps reached an unimaginable level of horror. Over 2,000 black citizens, including pregnant women, the elderly, and tiny, helpless children, had fled the mechanized slaughter in the streets and plunged deep into the treacherous, freezing expanse of the piney woods. They hid in the dense, mosquito-choked thickets and the freezing mud, possessing absolutely no food, no clean water, and no shelter from the bitter autumn winds. For days, these terrified American citizens huddled in the dark wilderness, listening to the distant, rhythmic crack of vigilante rifles executing their neighbors, while wealthy white mobs actively patrolled the perimeters of the swamp with bloodhounds to ensure no one could return to their homes. Babies were born into the freezing mud of the Cape Fear wilderness, and elderly citizens quietly succumbed to exposure, their bodies sinking into the dark swamp water. The prosperous, educated black middle class of Wilmington had been violently transformed into desperate, starving refugees within their own city in less than 24 hours. The sheer devastating audacity of the coup was matched only by the highly calculated banishment of the surviving black political leadership. The newly installed illegitimate white government drew up a formalized hit list containing the names of prominent black business owners, fusionist politicians, and outspoken community leaders who had miraculously survived the initial massacre. Heavily armed squads of red shirts actively hunted these men down, dragging them from their hiding places and physically forcing them at gunpoint onto outbound trains. They were explicitly told that if they ever set foot inside the city limits of Wilmington again, they would be immediately and violently lynched. The economic miracle of the black middle class was aggressively dismantled, their properties seized, their businesses destroyed, and their political power permanently extinguished, inaugurating an incredibly dark, suffocating era of unchecked Jim Crow tyranny that would choke the state of North Carolina for generations to come. Blood soaked the cobblestones of the port city, but the most profound betrayal was still unfolding in the silent halls of Washington. While the red shirts proudly paraded through the conquered streets of Wilmington, desperate telegrams from the fleeing fusionist leaders flooded the desk of President William McKinley. They frantically begged the federal government to intervene, to deploy United States troops to crush the treasonous coup and restore the legally elected democracy. But the President of the United States chose absolute, terrifying silence. He refused to send a single federal soldier to protect the black citizens of North Carolina, effectively endorsing the violent overthrow of an American city by a heavily armed white supremacist militia. This paralyzing federal cowardice sent a massive, chilling signal to every racist political syndicate in the Jim Crow South that they could orchestrate mass murder, deploy rapid-fire machine guns against civilians, and steal democratic elections with total, unchecked impunity. The physical slaughter was immediately followed by a massive, highly coordinated national media cover-up. The Northern press, including prestigious media institutions that claim to champion objective truth, eagerly swallowed the fabricated propaganda fed to them by the aristocratic conspirators. Major newspapers explicitly reported the horrific, one-sided massacre as a chaotic race riot provoked by lawless black citizens. They actively praised the heavily armed white death squads as honorable civic leaders who bravely stepped in to restore public order. The innocent victims who had been hunted in the streets and driven into the freezing swamps were violently blamed for their own extermination. The true, terrifying narrative, a meticulously planned, corporate-funded paramilitary coup d'etat, was deliberately buried beneath mountains of sophisticated journalistic lies. The vibrant, multiracial economic miracle of Wilmington was permanently shattered. Before the red shirts dragged their machine gun through the streets, the city was a shining beacon of black prosperity with a thriving, empowered black majority. In the agonizing weeks and months following the mechanized slaughter, thousands of traumatized black professionals, skilled artisans, and terrified families fled North Carolina forever. They were forced to abandon their beautiful homes, their lucrative businesses, and their generational wealth to the very vigilantes who had orchestrated the massacre. The white aristocratic elite actively seized the stolen property, permanently rewriting the demographic and economic makeup of the region. Wilmington was violently transformed overnight from the most progressive, politically integrated metropolis in the South into a suffocating, hyper-segregated stronghold of unchallenged white supremacy. For nearly a century, the horrific truth of the Wilmington coup was methodically, intentionally erased from the American consciousness. The arrogant aristocrats who orchestrated the mechanized slaughter of innocent citizens and the violent overthrow of a legally elected government did not spend a single day in a federal prison cell. Instead, they were universally celebrated by the white establishment as prominent, noble civic heroes. Their names were proudly carved into the heavy stone facades of public high schools, massive state university buildings, and sprawling local parks. They actively seized control of the state's educational boards and personally wrote the official history textbooks that generations of North Carolina children were forced to read. In those sanctioned pages, they deliberately framed their treasonous, blood-soaked paramilitary rebellion as a heroic rescue of the city from corrupt rule. The traumatized descendants of the black citizens who were hunted through the freezing swamps with rapid-fire machine guns were physically forced to live in a hyper-segregated society, walking past towering bronze monuments dedicated to the exact men who had stolen their generational wealth and murdered their grandfathers. It was a highly weaponized, incredibly sophisticated psychological operation designed to permanently sever a population from its own true history and enforce a culture of terrified, unbroken silence. The digital ecosystem you are navigating right now is the direct, highly evolved descendant of that exact same historical cover-up. The elite architects of our modern reality no longer need to physically rewrite history textbooks or build massive bronze statues to maintain their grip on society. They utilize the invisible, incredibly sophisticated mechanics of the digital algorithm to keep you endlessly distracted by superficial outrage, viral trends, and meaningless entertainment. They rely heavily on your engineered amnesia. They desperately need you to believe the comforting lie that the American democratic system has always been an impenetrable, peaceful fortress, entirely safe from violent overthrow by wealthy elites. Because if you truly grasp the dark, heavily suppressed reality of 1898, that a well-funded, heavily armed political syndicate can successfully destroy a thriving multiracial democracy, violently rewrite the laws, and face zero legal consequences, the fragile illusion of your modern safety shatters instantly. You have a profound, dangerous obligation to violently reject this algorithmic pacifier. Take the heavy, blood-soaked history of the betrayed fusionist coalition and forge it into a massive intellectual weapon to shatter the digital matrix. We are actively forging an unbreakable, highly educated global battalion of truth seekers who refuse to let these terrifying historical warnings be deleted by the system. Stand up right now. Prove you are actively paying attention and show the establishment that we are everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our worldwide resistance. And make sure they know their absolute control ends today.